is our Rational Labs open event for the month of March. Most of you that follow us on Luma know that the events are broadcast there. For members, we have Ask Kristen Anything events that happen at the second week of each month. And we also have events that showcase the interesting things the Irrational Labs team are up to. And then once a month, we have one of these rocking events that are open to the general public. For those of you that don't know all about what we offer, first and foremost, we do have a membership Slack that's incredible. This is a spin-off of that work. Please go to the Irrational Labs website and go under membership, and you can learn all about it and what that includes. Furthermore, we run the coolest self-paced boot camps in the universe because they're not totally self-paced. We do have kickoff calls, we have office hours, and we have brilliant fellows with advanced degrees in behavioral science or behavioral science adjacent fields, helping you with projects that you're working on during the course. So there are 3 boot camps. There's the general behavioral design. That's like an intro to behavioral design, broad, lots of.
And you just muted yourself.
I don't know how I just muted myself, but it was probably pretty cool because people are like, wow, he paused. The other cool thing you need to know is we are consultancy. That is what we do. So if you have a big challenge or a big problem and you need people to go to solution mode, we can help you. We can partner with you to help you with product design, research and prototyping, marketing and growth, employee engagement, employee wellness. And we can come speak at your organization and we can do training at your organization. That's even there too. So feel free to reach out to anybody at our team about this, and we would love to collaborate with you. So before we get to the main event, and the main event, of course, being Rachel, I'm going to stop my screen sharing so Rachel can get ready. And I'm going to properly introduce her before we put her on full-blown superpower spotlight.
Yeah, I think that's my phone at school.
And if you have audio on, please mute it. But Rachel is the senior behavioral scientist at Indeed Equitable Hiring Solutions. She's a behavioral scientist who's passionate about rigorously designing products and services for social impact. In her role at Indeed, she is a co-founder of the Equitable Hiring Solutions team. Does that go by EHS? I hope it goes by EHS. There's a lot of syllables to say there all at once. So she founded the EHS, which I've just called that, and she's focused on building solutions that change the way enterprise customers hire for good. She started Indeed's first behavioral science practice focused on reducing bias in hiring to help all people find meaningful work. Previously, Rachel led a portfolio of innovative pilots with local governments applying behavioral science and machine learning to reduce poverty and inequality with the behavioral science firm Ideas 42. She holds a BA from that little university in Palo Alto called Stanford, and in international relations and economics, and an MA in development economics and human security from the Fletcher School at Tufts University. Ladies and gentlemen, you are in for a treat today. She has an alliteration. She's an RR. Rachel Rosenberg is going to melt your minds today. Let's give her your best emojis, or you could even come off mute really quickly and clap. But then just go back to mute. So thank you for joining us today, Rachel. We cannot wait to learn from you.
Thank you for that. Hi, everyone. So many familiar faces in the audience. Really glad that you all could join. Let's get started because I have a lot to share with you today. So first of all, good morning. I really look forward to this discussion. We've already gone through my introduction, so I'll skip that. But just quickly, I just want to mention, Indeed, what are we? We're the #1 job site in the world. We have over 300 million unique visitors every month. And our mission is that we help people get jobs. I just want to take a moment. My heart goes out to all of the Indeedians and their families this week who were impacted by layoffs. It's a tricky time in the economy right now. And so I'm here. If this network can become a network of support for those who are looking for work, that would be excellent. So I want the session to be relatively interactive. I want to know who you are. So to get this started, I know there's a lot of people in the room, but just drop your name, your title, why you're here in the chat. I'll just give you a moment to do that, and that way I can start to see who's here today. That work? Are people seeing chats coming through? I'm not.
I don't think we can send messages.
Oh, you
maybe
can't
because we
chat.
were, yeah, maybe because we were muted. I can only see the option to message the host.
Okay,
Yeah,
no problem.
I'm seeing the message of the host as well. So let's do it where I verbalize stuff. The hosts are getting all kinds of information. So we have Dave Myers is here. Hey, Dave, he works in K-12 workforce development. We have a UX UI designer with 5+ years of experience. Annie is the lead learning scientist at Praxis Labs. Let's see, Colin is BSci and Indeed. I think he must know you.
I believe.
Let's see, we have Amy Matilla is an innovation product manager. Valerie Black is a senior behavioral scientist at Hinge Health. Josh Gussif is with Customer Centric LLC. We have an experimental psychologist, Erwin. Let's see, Armin is a behavioral scientist. Jordan Gross is a product manager at Capital One. Oh, our man Bjorn in Berlin, he works with Springer Press. It's an academic press. Noah is in Kenya. He's a commercial manager at Siva Logistics. And you get the sense we have a very diverse crew here today in lots of different fields.
Thank you so much for doing that. Yeah, I just wanted to see kind of, who's in the room and what kind of backgrounds they have, why you're here. So really excited to have you. So what I'll cover today, I'm going to walk you through the methodology that we use at Indeed to apply behavioral science to product design. I'll call it BSci. That's just short for behavioral science. And at some points, I'll be drawing from an example from Indeed to illustrate a concrete application. I'll mention we have not invented this methodology at Indeed. This framework that I'll present draws from work that I did while I was at Ideas 42, from work that Indeed has done in collaboration with the Rational Labs, and from many other collaborators in the field that I've worked with and interacted with over the last several years. So for those of you who are here today, shout out to those of you who have worked with me on this throughout the years of applying behavioral science. So I present you with DDDT, which you might refer to as triple DT. And what this stands for is define, diagnose, design, and test. And so hopefully by the end of this hour, my goal is that you're going to be able to tell me what each of these means and also how to apply it to product. So DDDT is detailed. It starts with problem definition, which means describing a user's behavior and how we want it to change. So in other words, we need a neat behavioral problem statement that says users are doing X and we want them to do Y. From there, I go to a phase that I call behavioral diagnosis, which describes all the steps that we take to identify a set of prioritized hypotheses about why users are doing X. And then that leads us to the phase where behavioral ideation leads to designs, and alongside them, some new hypotheses. And someone is off mute who is getting some background noise. If you can mute, that'd be great. Seems like in a different language too. Great, I'll keep going. And then lastly, there's the test phase. So test refers to a live A/B test that helps us measure whether our designs had an impact on the key behavior that we identified back way at the beginning. So that's a lot, right? And it is. And to be honest, it's really not that simple either. The process is recursive and it's iterative. So often, for example, a learning that we get during the behavioral diagnosis phase can lead us to completely revise the problem definition that we started with. And we expect to be revising our beliefs, revising our assumptions at every step of the process. And when you reach the end, it's not over. It's almost certain that you'll be going back to the beginning and starting over. So in other words, DDDT should not be considered a one-off process. This is one of the advantages that I found to being embedded in a company. I noticed that some of you are and some of you are not. I found that rather than operating in a consulting capacity, this is a place where you can have opportunities to not just go through the process once, but then have opportunities to refine and improve the initial solution that you test. Happy to talk about that more if it's of interest. One more high level point before we get into each step. So there is certainly a difference between the ideal, and that's what I'll present you with today, and then the reality, where often we end up truncating this process to fit itself into the problem space. So what are some examples of that? So often people will come to our team saying, we know X happens, why might that be? And in that case, we might say, give them a list of hypotheses that we generate together to do a brainstorm about what might be going on. Sometimes someone will come to us that says, we're revamping X. How should it look? And in that case, we might just hit the drawing board and think about some of the behavioral concepts that have worked in other contexts and come up with a set of design recommendations. We also get, we know X happens. Can behavioral science tell us why and what to do about it? So there, maybe it's a list of hypotheses from behavioral diagnosis and some design concepts to go alongside them. Sometimes it's our thing failed. Why? This happens quite a bit. And so there we might support the team to generate a list of hypotheses, coming up with some quick test recommendations, and then advising through an analysis so that we can quickly learn how to improve something that's not working. Oh, and then of course there's the X is related to B side. What do you think? And we do a lot of this too, just to spread the knowledge as much as possible. So let's get into some of the specifics. The first piece is, how do I define my problem? Some of you have probably seen this quote before. I've been carrying it with me for a while. If I were given 1 hour to save the planet, says Albert Einstein, I would spend 55 minutes defining the problem and 5 minutes resolving it. So that's to say, helping teams define problems is a really important task. And many of the problems that we see could have actually been avoided through better problem definition at the beginning. And so if you ask, when is the right time for problem definition? It's not just when people ask you, what is the problem? It's during customer discovery, trying to figure out what the heck it is that customers need. During retrospectives, and people are looking back at something and trying to figure out how it went. When something stops working or is broken. Those are all really good moments to go back and start with a problem definition. And a behavioral problem definition focuses on the gap between intention and action, or something that we call the intention-action gap. So maybe you all could think of an example in your own life, and feel free to put this in the chat, where you see a gap between your intentions and your actions. Lots of behavioral scientists in the room, so maybe with users that you've worked with or something. There's a question, is there a presentation? Are you all seeing my screen?
I think
Yes, we are, Rachel.
Cool.
Yes.
Awesome. Cool. So maybe you're coming up with some ideas. I can't actually see the chat, so just we'll keep moving through it. But some things that come to mind for me: showing up on time to meetings, maybe eating healthy foods, maybe getting to that gym class on Friday afternoon instead of happy hour, right? Or maybe it's spending more time reading with your kids. The point is that we're all subject to the intention-action gap, as many of you know, and so are our users. And so our role as behavioral scientists is to help close that intention-action gap by changing the context we put our users in. Okay, so let's get into an example from Indeed. The problem that we investigated at the time is that 70% of job seekers never arrived to interviews that they had booked on Indeed with employers who were using this option for virtual interviewing. So like a Zoom, but run by Indeed. And of course, we want job seekers to arrive at these interviews. So we asked the question, when in the workflow do users, job seekers, become a no-show, somebody that didn't show for an interview? And we learned that specifically, job seekers become a no-show if they never click join your interview and arrive into a virtual interview room. And that would come from an email or a text message confirmation that Indeed would have sent them. So pictured here is a quick overview of that flow. At the time, job seekers, they signed up for an interview and picked a time. They completed some optional pre-screeners. They received an interview confirmation from Indeed. They received some email and text message reminders, and then they could click join your interview from those reminders or confirmation email. And here are some images of the product to sort of make this feel more concrete. So you'll notice on the first screen, as a job seeker, you can select a specific interview time, in this case with a customer service representative role. Here's the email confirmation that they received. So this is sort of the template email confirmation. You can see there, you can join your interview from this, or you can change or cancel your interview time from this notification. And then they can click join your interview button and show up for the virtual interview room. And this is just a screenshot of what that looks like on mobile. Okay, so if only 30% of job seekers are showing up to interviews and you own the product for this, for scheduling and supporting job seekers to show up, how would you define the problem? So I want you to actually write down something, like write down a problem definition, type it in your notes doc, just try it. And then what I want you to do is test that against the best practices that I give you in the next few slides. So just take 1 minute. How would you define the problem that we faced here? Okay, maybe you put it in your head, maybe you wrote it down. I won't hold it against you if you didn't do it at all. Okay, so I want to talk about some best practices for defining a problem statement. Often stakeholders will jump to some assumptions about the problem prior to defining it and use that as the problem statement. So when does that happen? Often people assume that information leads to action. So they might say, well, we need to educate people about the importance of showing up because they must think it's okay to ghost an interview. Look at what people do on dating apps these days. Another thing that comes up is just improve the benefits. This is sort of a traditional economic view of the world. So they might say, oh, we need to make interviewing more valuable for job seekers if we expect them to show up. Or reduce the costs. Also sort of econ-y, maybe it's just too costly, or maybe the opportunity cost is too high. And then lastly, context doesn't matter. Like, we applied all the best practices, we sent reminders, why aren't people showing? This worked for flu shot adherence, shouldn't it work here? And of course, as behavioral scientists, we know that context matters. The other thing to keep in mind is to define this at the right level. So if you come up with a problem statement that's too narrow, too broad, you might find yourself with either too much or too little to be working on. So here's some questions that you can test your problem statement against as you're defining it. The first is a user mentioned? So if I were to say, we want an increase in completed interviews, no user there. So that's actually a business outcome. You also want to ask, could the behavior be misinterpreted? So we want job seekers to show up. We'll show up where, when? That's starting to get too general. Is the behavior observable and measurable? This is important because we want to avoid perceptions, attitudes, and beliefs as part of our problem statement. So we want job seekers to love interviews on Indeed. Maybe we could get kind of a sentiment of that, but it's not what we're going for in terms of the core problem statement. It's not behavioral. And last, is this correlated to what we really want to see? Is this sort of, are we looking at a proxy instead of what we really care about, or something we might call a behavioroid? So something like that would be, oh, we want job seekers to log into Indeed on their interview day. Well, it's not quite right? You're not quite getting to the problem. So how do we define our problem statement? Our decision, or the sort of the demonstration of intention, the choice here is, do I want to show up to the interview? The action would be to actually appear in the video call. And so our problem definition, and I'm curious how close this is to what you wrote down, is that we want job seekers to show up to the virtual interviews that they book with employers on Indeed. So it's not too general, it's not a behavioroid, it's relatively specific, hopefully not construed. Okay, great. So working with this, I want to talk about an additional consideration for problem definition, which is how to define an ethical problem. So one criticism or concern that I'm sure many of you are familiar with in the context of applied behavioral science is that we could potentially use our techniques to influence users in ways that don't serve their intentions. In other words, rather than closing that intention-action gap, institutions could paternalistically ignore intentions and close the gap between what corporations want users to do and what users are actually doing. So this can be referred to as sludging, and our friend Cass wrote an entire book about it. But since then, the field has continued to try to address the concern. I think all of us should be a part of this conversation. So just this week, actually, Michael Halsworth, who's the director of behavioral insights team, published a new behavioral science manifesto that highlights some of these concerns. And I really liked the two terms he used as some of the key criticisms related to sludging. The first is this concept of control paradigm. It's the idea that the BSI approach is elitist and doesn't pay enough attention to people's own goals, and could use concepts that sort of attempt to justify the control of behavior, since they lack the means perhaps to do so themselves. The other is ethical concerns. So this is the idea that as behavioral scientists applying this more and more, becoming more ambitious, we as a community are going to face more dilemma as it relates to ethical concerns, transparency, and privacy. And so what he posits, and I agree, is that behavioral scientists must adopt principles, ideals, and standards of conduct that help us determine two things: what it is that we work on, and also how we do it. So I think Michael might agree with me that one of the best ways to address these issues is to choose problems that fall in the center of this diagram. And so with our team at Indeed, we're always assessing this, and we suggest that we choose problems that address not just the business's needs, but also customers' needs and society's needs, and even more so, their interpretation of their desired behavior as the central focus of problem definition. So when we say place the customer's needs and desires, as well as society's alongside the business needs, I believe that we must do this with humility. From our vantage point, we can't deem ourselves experts on people's interpretations of their beliefs, their feelings, their behaviors based on our own experiences. You hear this all the time in product. You are not your user. You are not your customer, right? So we must go and ask people, including especially marginalized voices and communities, to investigate our assumptions about what their intentions are. So Michael uses the term, it's fancy, epistemic humility. I think it's kind of sticky. And this has actually always been a foundational concept for the scientific community. And so I don't think it should come at any surprise. So let's go back to our example of no showing an interview. I want to posit a couple of questions. Can we presume that job seekers who book interviews with employers want to show up? Is it universally good for job seekers to attend every interview that they sign up for? Is it good for society? So I want to show you a chart that helps me better answer this question by looking at the importance of features when trying to predict whether or not a job seeker would not show. And what we learned is that job seekers prioritize interviews that are more desirable and relevant to them. So we'll talk about this later. The most predictive feature of show rates was actually days before the interview. So the farther away the interview is, the less likely it is for a job seeker to show up. And so this will play into some of our hypotheses later. But also, I want you to note that what may look like an intention failure on our end may actually be a good choice for job seekers. So if a job was less relevant, meaning the title was different from their previous roles on their resume, it was far away, or if it's less desirable, meaning their peers rated the company poorly, it doesn't pay very well, then they were less likely to go when the time came. So again, this leads us to potentially define our problem differently. So is it that we want job seekers to show up perhaps to relevant and desirable jobs? And is that good for businesses, for business and society? Just to hammer this home, I want to just mention that the FTC has submitted guidelines that require businesses to think about sludging. Dark patterns, I think, are a category of sludging. You can debate that if you like. And they're defining these as design tricks and psychological tactics that get consumers to part with their money or with their data. And so this is now a real liability for businesses. And I suggest that you go read this. If you Google FTC guidelines on dark patterns, it'll come right up. And it is not a light read, so I would say peruse it and look at the examples, because it's really interesting to see how the FTC is defining when a business is intentionally getting users to part unknowingly with their data or with their money. Okay, I was going to do a little section here, but because of the nature of the chat, etc., Feel free to pour questions, comments, compliments in there. We'll answer them at the end. And I'm just going to take a deep breath because we're halfway through the slides. And what we do? We spent less than what Albert would recommend, about half of our time talking about problem definition. So here we'll just dive into behavioral diagnosis. Love the chat happening too, keep it up. So how do I diagnose my problem? I've listed a lot of things in this step. It's a laundry list: behavioral mapping, lit review, contextual reconnaissance, user research, data analysis. Rachel, what the heck are all these things? Before we get into that, I will tell you, but let's talk about the reasoning behind behavioral diagnosis. Does anybody know how polar bears hunt for seals? I'm gonna let you ponder that. See if anything comes in the chat. So I'll just tell you, they wait at breathing holes or at the water's edge, just looking for a seal to pop up, because seals eventually have to pop up for air. And I think this is a good metaphor for how often teams identify hypotheses and what's causing the behaviors that they want to address. And so they're just waiting to see what pops up. And really, that's not the best way to get a rigorous and comprehensive sense for why people are acting the way that they do. And so behavioral diagnosis is systematic and evidenced, an evidenced way to understand a user's context and, of course, how that context influences their behavior. So Lee Ross and Richard Nisbett have this foundational perspective in their book, The Person in the Situation, also kind of a fun read, where they demonstrate how, quote, seemingly small situational factors that operate on important input or output channels will often exert gratifyingly large effects. Or in other words, our contexts actually have an outsized influence on our behavior. And as you all know, in a systematic and predictable way. And so behavioral diagnosis is about observing, articulating, and validating those contextual features and their potential influence on the behavior that we care about. When I say systematic, I mean we take steps to make sure that our own biases don't get in the way of us discovering how features of a context influence behavior. So this process includes mapping where users make choices and take actions, forming a set of behavioral hypotheses, taking steps to validate those hypotheses, meaning confirm, refute, or revise them, and then prioritizing them. And it's really not that quite linear. So I'll take you back to an example so you can see that. So first, a process map. A process map outlines the decisions and the actions that a user has to take in order to do their desired behavior. And in our example, so remember, 70% of job seekers who signed up for an interview weren't showing. And we talked about how a job seeker becomes a no-show if they don't appear in the video call during the time of their scheduled interview. So what we're trying to learn here is what additional decisions and actions must a job seeker take to appear in that video call? And also, what are the steps that they actually, so it's what are the additional decisions they have to take and what are the additional actions they have to take to actually appear in that video call? And this is where I brought in what I call contextual reconnaissance. What that really means is just go do it yourself. So I signed up for an interview. I signed up for a couple of interviews, and I tried to show, and I took notes on all the ways in which I might fail to show or be confused about it, or all of the other things that happened. So what were all the decisions I had to make, and what were all the actions that I had to take? And after going through the process ourselves, and after speaking with job seekers, two additional decision nodes, well, actually one additional decision node and one additional action node revealed themselves. So another decision that job seekers have to make in this process is, do I want this job? So as it turns out, job seekers weren't fully evaluating a role prior to scheduling an interview and needed to still take this step of deciding whether they wanted the job. And second, an important step that many job seekers who no-showed wanted to take was to cancel or reschedule their interviews, but they had trouble taking that action. So once you have a sense for the decisions and the actions that are critical to your key behavior, you want to come up with as many hypotheses as you can for what barriers users may face and what features of the context may influence those barriers. So again, I'm going to use an example. A A contextual feature that I already revealed to you is that job seekers can RSVP to a job more than 2 weeks out from the interview. And so let's see, how did I do this? Yes. So what we observed is that job seekers have time and consistent preferences. So interviews far out in time may seem good in the moment, but their preferences change as they get closer to the interview. And so how might you validate this? Well, the way we did it is we looked at feature importance to see what features of an RSVP predicted a no-show. And as I showed you before, distance to the job was the strongest predictor. So quick note here, some behavioral scientists like to go through contextual reconnaissance to validate their process map before going into behavioral mapping. Others prefer to enter reconnaissance with some clear hypotheses so that they can confirm and refute behavioral hypotheses as they observe features of the context. I say choose best based on your best knowledge of the context, right? Like this just depends. In this case, I chose to sign up for an interview first because I had very little familiarity with the workflow and I didn't feel like I could build a good decision action map or even come up with hypotheses if I didn't start by just going through the flow myself. From there, we want to consistently widen the hypotheses that we come up with. Again, this is trying to get in the way of our own biases. And so we try to ask ourselves questions in the following categories. So first, looking at the moment of choice. What's the angle on the choice? What's the field of choice? What are options? What are the consequences of the choice? And how does the user value the choice? And then in the moment of action, first of all, does the moment of choice exist? Does the moment of action exist? And if so, can you change your mind? Can you defer action? And so all of these categories, there are others, but these are really the core ones. These help you start to get into the potential psychological effects that relate the context to the behavior. So again, I'll take an example. So when thinking about moment of choice, that first category, we could ask ourselves the following questions just about the moment of choice itself. Do I show up to an interview? And then we added, do I want this job? So in the moment of choice, is the job seeker making a conscious decision? Are they aware they're making a decision? Was there a failure to choose in the first place? Does the choice present itself at the right moment? Perhaps there's something painful about the choice that makes job seekers hide from it. Or was the problem not salient? So you failed to think about it at the time that they could have chosen at all. So I want you to just think, what hypotheses do these questions raise for you? What features of the context might cause job seekers to not act or to not decide? Really, this is moment of choice, so to not make the decision. And some common principles that come up in this space: inattention, automaticity, choice conflict, status quo bias, ostriching, and of course, the list could go on. And so for each of those categories, asking these kinds of questions allows us to expand ourselves to a long list of behavioral hypotheses that then we can go validate. And once you have that long list, there are lots of ways to go about that validation. So I've listed some here, and you can read the slide, but when using these methods, you're asking yourself, what questions do I need to answer? And then how does that help us choose the methodology that we want to use to answer those questions? And so maybe you want to know, what do researchers in the field of psychology, economics, behavioral science, what do they already know about this behavior or similar behaviors? That's a lit review. Or what do the data say about whether or not my hypotheses are true? Maybe that's data analysis. What do users say about the experience? And now we know that users, what they say and do is different, but can you observe tendencies that give you signal about your hypotheses? And then what demonstrated behavior would confirm your primary hypotheses? And often that's something that we can observe in quantitative surveys. The result of this is to try to validate some hypotheses, confirm them or refute them, and use that to prioritize those that come out as validated. So in this example, we hypothesized that job seekers had time and inconsistent preferences, meaning that their preferences shift from the time they RSVP, sign up for the interview, to when they're scheduled. But we built on this hypothesis after doing a quantitative user survey and speaking with job seekers who had no-showed a prior event. And it was interesting. Job seekers talked about how they cast a wide net And then they wait for recruiters to reach out to them to personally confirm an interview prior to fully committing to that interview. Once they hear back about an application, then they have a new moment to revisit their decision to continue with an interview. And actually, when we surveyed job seekers who had no-showed, 1 in 3 of them were still waiting to hear back for the role, allegedly. The interview had long passed. So this helped us realize that the typical workflow the job seekers were used to was they'd receive a note from a recruiter after they applied to a role, after perhaps that application passed the initial screen, at which point they had a moment of choice to accept or decline an invitation to interview. So in a new world where a recruiter no longer needs to reach out to schedule, job seekers were still waiting for that familiar signal and didn't have a moment of choice to decide, do I want this job? So with time and consistent preferences, job seekers were applying to jobs prior to even taking the step to evaluate whether they'd want the job once contacted. So then what happens? That's a lot. I'm going to take this now into design. We can answer questions at the end if you have them. Also, you can debate me on whether this is time and consistent preferences. I actually think it's a lot of things. We can talk about that too if you're interested. So the output of the diagnosis phase is a list of validated hypotheses with several components. The first being the contextual features that trigger them, and then a description of their psychological drivers. In the design phase, we want to take those behavioral diagnoses that are validated into strategies for addressing them directly. Okay, so design. Often we have a tendency to wait for a light bulb to go off for what a brilliant solution should be. But in reality, coming up with a design is a much longer and arduous process that has to be repeated multiple times before you're successful. Something much more akin to climbing a very hard rock climbing route. And so, I don't know, I'm a rock climber, so I love this metaphor. But what do we do when we climb a hard route? We project it, we try it over and over again, we fail, we watch others be successful, we try what they did, and then eventually we send. And that's what we're looking to do here. So you should draw from other successful and failed attempts to solve similar problems. And you should know that every body's a little bit different. Maybe I can get a heel hook that high in the air, but somebody else can't. And so every context requires some creativity to adapt prior solutions to the specific situation. And those solutions should really draw directly from your behavioral diagnosis. So don't lose sight of the validated hypotheses you're bringing into this phase. So what we do on our team is we often set aside time to brainstorm how we're going to directly use our behavioral diagnosis to address the problem in the context of what we know about prior behavioral interventions. And so what I mean is, even before going into a design session with other stakeholders, spending some time trying to connect the validated hypotheses to some design principles or guidelines. So one version of this, the output of that sort of inner team brainstorm, is to imagine behavioral barriers as if they're physical, literally physical barriers, and then asking a series of how might we statements, HMW is that acronym there, for how might we lower or eliminate a barrier. So changing the contextual feature that gives rise to the barrier itself. Or how might we walk around the barrier, changing the subject's path altogether? Or how might we go over the barrier? Can we increase the subject's motivation to overcome it and leap it? In other cases, design concepts may just be what I could think about as the inverse of the contextual feature that you identified in your validated hypothesis. So in this case, in our example, we identified that job seekers are used to recruiters reaching out to them after they submit an application to arrange an interview time, and that the virtual interview experience lacked this moment to prime job seekers to visit their preferences. So that, alongside our hypothesis about time and consistent preferences, leads us to easily flip the context. So I'll just pause and give you a second to think, how might you flip this contextual feature that there's no moment of choice that primes job seekers to revisit those preferences? So said very basically, you could say, oh, well, you create a moment of choice, but that could take many different forms, right? So that's just the beginning. That's sort of like your cue that you want to bring in to your design session. I'm going to reveal now what we did about it. So we created a moment of choice for job seekers to revisit their preferences with a personal message from a recruiter prior to the interview that fits with this mental model for how job seekers would typically revisit the choice. And then also we created a message about canceling or rescheduling that normalizes the need to do so as a result of the decision. So like if you decide, oh, actually, I don't want this job, then there's some action that you can take that still doesn't make you a no-show, or that means you won't be skipping the interview. So when it comes to actually running these workshops, I have a few tips. I'll talk about them briefly. So first, really important to prepare stakeholders to brainstorm in advance, especially if these are virtual brainstorms, which I think for many of us, this is the case now. And I often break the sessions up into 2 or 3 or 4 sessions because it can be fatiguing to be in these sessions for a long time. In the first session, you brainstorm ideas, and in the second session, or maybe in the 4th session, however long it takes, you select some of those ideas and draft out some concepts together. My other advice here is that I often opt to be as inclusive as possible for these workshops, meaning at a minimum, involve designers and engineers and researchers, but really whomever else might bring a really valuable perspective to the room. So in this case, maybe you want to have somebody who's a job seeker co-designing with you, just a consideration. Functionally, I often use a spreadsheet to guide the ideation that follows directly from our diagnosis, or I build a collaboration board like in Miro or Figma. And really the key here is to use structure to keep your participants on task. So that's ahead of time drafting the how might we statements for each prioritized hypothesis. And even ahead of time identifying some behavioral science best practices so that those who are unfamiliar with typical applications of behavioral science are guided to come up with them, because you can say, oh, well, time and consistent preferences, how might we create a moment of choice, right? So you're not expecting that people know the behavioral science, but you can guide them towards solutioning around it. And give people time, let them individually brainstorm, and then bring people together so that nobody's anchored to one idea. I'm sure you all have gone through this before, and share an affinity map as a group. And then also in a follow-on session, I like to give people a chance to select their top ideas. I find that this really drives quite a bit of alignment. If people feel like they're included in having a voice on what it is that we try. And I suggest that you draw out concepts, because often in just writing a few words on a sticky note or in a spreadsheet can really lose some of the nuance about what people are thinking about. And sometimes some of the most innovative ideas come out when you start to draw them. And as a team, it's important to align on an intervention that is both high impact, and you all know my definition of high impact by now, good for business, users, and society, and low effort, meaning something that you do really quickly and you could learn fast from and iterate. Because remember, this is a recursive and iterative process. And so if we run a test that's going to take months and months, it's going to be really hard to continue with the momentum to continue to experiment and build on our sense for our behavioral hypothesis and then our theory of change for how the design impacts behavior. Okay, we are making really good time, actually. So this is good. The last section here is, how do I go from a design to a test? So the truth is that I give a whole presentation, hour, 90-minute, 2-hour long on testing. I think it's a really tricky subject, and depending on where you're coming from, you have different knowledge that you bring to the table. So I just wanted to give you a few considerations in this session around running behavioral experiments. So behavioral experiments in a nutshell. So my first point is that testing is all about answering one fundamental question, which is what works? So you all are probably familiar that in 2019, Esther Duflo, Avi Banerjee, Michael Kramer, they won the Nobel Prize in economics for their experimental approach to alleviating poverty. And for a long time in business, in tech, we tested products to see what would sell, right? But since the 90s, there's a whole discipline that has emerged that's dedicating not what will sell, but what works for the service design. And that measures more than just revenue or bottom line. Instead, this evaluation defines outcomes that matter to the people for whom the services are designed, and it measures impact based on a theory of change. And these methods now very much dominate in modern development economics, but also in tech development. And so what do I mean when I talk about a theory of change? So when we run A/B tests on behavioral design, a critical part of this is that the test is asking questions along the theory of change. And so let's see if I can do this metaphor. I think of a theory of change as being like a stack of dominoes. And I realize this could start to get distracting. You'll see it over and over again. But when I say it's like a stack of dominoes, what I mean is a theory of change requires that every single piece of the puzzle fits together so that every block is positioned correctly to fall over. And similarly with an experiment that's testing behavioral hypotheses, we want to be able to ask our question, what has to fall into place at every step for the change to impact outcomes? So in the job seeker no-show example, it's not enough if we just see job seekers showing up to more interviews. What we need to see is that people opened that email, they clicked into it, people actually changed and rescheduled and canceled their interviews, and they joined using that interview button. Also, there's some other things you might measure along the way, like we had to solicit the message from the employer. Maybe we weren't successfully able to solicit the message from the employer. And so even if we saw an increase in interviews, if there were no employer messages, that doesn't confirm our theory of change, that personal note that contributed to a moment of choice would impact behavior. And so we want to know that each step is falling into place such that that last block falls over. And so, really what I'm asking here is, do you actually care about that final outcome and increase in shows to interviews if all the other dominoes didn't fall into place? And so then the goal is to think about, as you're designing experiments, to measure each of the dominoes. So can you find a way to see that job seekers noticed that there was an email, they opened it, they looked at it, they interpreted it as a moment of choice, they made that decision, and that informed their behavior about whether or not to show up. And so this is about measuring more than just business outcomes, but actually try to better understand whether our hypotheses can be validated in testing. And then, of course, we want to use those findings to learn whether we were right and learn what works so that we can continue to iterate on our solution. So that takes us back to the start. Again, this is not a one-way road. So hopefully you do it once, you do it again, and then you do it again, and you keep doing it so that we can continue to influence behavior in the direction that our users, that the business and society cares about. So that's it. I told you that by the end of this hour, you'd be able to tell me what each of these means and how to apply it to product. I hope you feel like I did that, or at least that we scratched the surface. And with that, I think Ryan is going to facilitate some questions.
Yes, we've got questions coming in fast and furious. Again, for those of you not watching the chat, I decided to go to a Google Doc. My guess is from timing, we'll probably get to about 5. So Charlene, would you mind coming off mute and asking the first profound question?
Thank you. Can you hear me all right?
Oh my gosh, you sound brilliant.
Hi, Rachel. Thank you for the talk. So I was wondering, it's not the first time I was thinking about this, is that there seems to be, well, my shallow understanding of behavioral science and UX research, UX design, it seems that behavioral science has the background of heavy quant and statistics and academic research. So a lot of insight comes from, not solely, but comes from, research suggested, 80% people would do this. Therefore, we're confident the next person would do this kind of thing. And let's go in and, pretty much get it done this way. While user research is starting from the other end, where it goes like, oh, we've seen this behavior. We've interviewed 5 to 10 people. We've done some user testing. There seems to be a theme. Let's go from there. We think that's something to work on. And as the years develop, I've seen now behavioral science conferences are now talking about, okay, research isn't actually right for this client. We start to use empathy. We actually talk to the client and then we look at the context a bit more. While on the same side, the UX UX space is now doing more, using more using data and merging that into their practice. And just now the workshop example you gave.
Oops, Charlene, you hit mute for a second.
Oh yeah, I was gonna say. Uh-oh, spaghetti.
That is really interesting. I think it was an arrow, like the arrow key or something. I just brushed over it. Yeah, so I'm saying the workshop slide that you had, it was pretty much the same pattern as the UX training that I attended. So my convoluted background, my question is, where do you see the distinction currently still is between the two fields?
Yeah, thanks, Charlene. The first thing I want to say with this is I think that UX research and behavioral science share a lot of methods and share a lot of principles. And I think UX research is a really important, valuable discipline. And I work with UX researchers in the behavioral science process all the time. Similarly, I think behavioral science adds additional complementary value to a team that already has UX researchers. That said, you can train UX researchers to do behavioral science, and you can train behavioral scientists to do UX research. What are the distinctions? I think what you pointed out is important, which is that behavioral science draws on this large discipline from behavioral science, economics, psychology to bring evidence to the conversation when trying to develop hypotheses and go into the design concepts. Also, I would suggest that following this kind of methodology and framework in a rigorous and systematic way is not something that's replicated in every UX research process, although I have seen some do so. And lastly, there's this sort of concept that what people say is not necessarily what they do. And so behavioral scientists are really trying hard to figure out how do you get around that conundrum. We should still talk to people and learn about what it is that they want to be doing and what it is they say they do. But then we should also take that with a grain of salt and figure out ways to validate that or not validate that in other places. Thanks so much for the question.
Oh, that's excellent. This next question, Rachel, does not have a human attached to it, but I can ask it. What is the hardest grade you've climbed?
Such a good, such fun question for me. Let's see. So on lead, my highest lead route is outside is 11D. My highest onsite is an 11A. And this past weekend, I climbed my first V3 boulder outside.
That is next level. Very cool. Avi, would you mind coming off mute and asking your question? Oh, Sam said, "Oh, dang." Yeah, great. Thank you, Sam. That was awesome. And Shay gave you a.
That's incredible. I see you have this. We can just do real quick. Just in practice, I've seen a lot of research efforts wasted when the question is not defined.
Oh, I accidentally muted you, Avi. I was trying to spotlight you. Can you unmute? There you go.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, that was my fault. Sorry. Carry on.
Oh no, you're fine. I know you had a slide on this, so I'll I just curious if you have any more thoughts on defining the question well. I've just seen a lot of research efforts kind of through a lot of work where they're still not applicable, and curious if there's any more rules of thumb or case studies or further resources you recommend.
Yeah, let's see, resources. I might push the question to resources to Irrational Labs, who does a really good job at advising with this stuff. I would say from my experience, this is the hardest thing with stakeholders, is that I want to spend a lot of time defining the problem correctly, and there can be pressure to move past this phase because it doesn't feel like work is getting done. And so what I try to do is tell stories about how important it is to define the right problem. And so, for example, there's a very classic set of studies from the development economics space where we thought, the problem was that people didn't have insecticide treated nets, but it turns out really there's a core problem that people don't have access to tools to feed themselves. And so if you look at some of the research around insecticide treated nets and how some of our interventions globally have been totally like blasphemous in terms of we've spent a ton of money on one thing and then people use that thing in another way, and it's because we just didn't ever really define what the problem was. So what I do is I try to go to other fields and find examples where I feel like it's compelling stories. And sorry, I wasn't able to present you with a very compelling story there, but I'm happy to follow up.
Yeah, on that note, we do have in our membership Slack, there's a channel called Tools, which is all about experimentation. And there's 2 modules in the self-paced course about experimentation. I don't believe, and I'm going to pass this to Shay, I don't believe we have like a cool guide to experimentation PDF yet, but I could be wrong. So do follow up with us if you are so inclined. Andrea, can you answer the final or ask the final question for today?
The keys are in the drawer. Thank you so much. I left him in there. Shall I retrieve him?
So somebody's keys are in the door, but Andrea, are you
Yes.
there? All right. Andrea's question's in the chat, Rachel, so I'm just going to ask it for her. She said in the brainstorming workshop, what if participants keep coming up with solution ideas that might not be backed up by BSci principles? Since the majority of them might not be familiar with BSci, should we be tied to those ideas, or should we still tie those ideas eventually with BSci principles? Ready, go.
Yeah, it's hard. What I do ahead of a behavioral science brainstorm is I actually do the brainstorm myself ahead of time and come up with a bunch of ideas so that when I go into the room, I can guide people towards the ideas that start to feel more behavioral in nature. This is where those how might we statements and those those prompts for design really matter. If you define the direction of the brainstorm well, hopefully the ideas will be behavioral in nature because you've basically asked them to design a behavioral intervention from the get-go. I will say it does happen that you'll get somebody saying, oh, we need to do an information campaign, or this, that, or the other. And that's, I think, where just being able to be an informant as a behavioral scientist and say, from a behavioral science perspective, this may not necessarily fit the behavioral hypotheses. Let's talk about it. But yeah, giving everybody space to share this. I find that a good conversation, even direction of like, oh, maybe we should throw that design out. Oh, skip there a little bit at the end. But my last point there was just that people tend to be very collaborative and interested to learn from us. And so they tend to not be hostile when you say, hey, let's think about how we might reframe that idea to be a little bit more behavioral in nature.
Rachel, thank you for such a brilliant talk today. If everybody, my dog apparently decided to bark on the cue there, if you heard that. If everybody could give her a round of applause, your best clap emojis. Thank you so much. It was really wonderful. It's always interesting for us too to see, how other folks' methodologies parallel the 3B methodology that we use. But just tons of wonderful insights. Be sure I put Rachel's LinkedIn in the chat, so be sure to follow Rachel on LinkedIn. Additionally, just your reminders, we are a consultancy. Should you need to partner someone with your BSci problems, we would be happy to connect with you. Go to the consulting tab at the Irrational Labs website. You want to learn more? Come take one of our boot camps. They're great fun, and they'll give you all kinds of insights and case studies. And lastly, want to join a community where people geek out on BSci 24/7 or at least 22/7? Join our membership Slack. We'd love to have you. Again, Rachel, thank you so much for your generosity, your genius, and your incredible spirit around this work. We cannot thank you enough. Everybody go forth, have a brilliant Friday. Maybe you're on Saturday. So just have a brilliant rest of whatever's left of whatever time zone you're in. And thank you again, everybody. Don't be strangers.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, we've stopped recording, right, Shay, or no?